Okay, so you know how when you think about the holidays, you think about those really comforting scents,
Yeah.
like baking and all that, and eggnog.
Right.
And there's one spice I bet you don't think about too much that is in a lot of those things,
Interesting.
and that is nutmeg. And you know what?
What?
We're going to take a deep dive into nutmeg today
Hmm.
because it actually has a history that is as captivating and as wild as like a pirate adventure or something.
Wow. I mean, yeah, when you think about nutmeg, you just think about, it's in your spice rack.
Right,
It's
exactly.
not very exciting.
But we're going to find out that nutmeg's journey from like this little Indonesian island all the way to our kitchens,
Yeah.
it's a story full of intrigue and deception and even genocide.
Oh, wow.
So we're going to learn all about that today.
Yeah, that sounds really fascinating. I'm excited to learn all about this. I'm sure our listeners are too.
Yeah, so nutmeg, it all starts in this tiny little place called the Banda Islands in
Yeah.
Indonesia.
Okay.
And it was so secretive, like the actual location of this island was a secret for centuries. So the Banda Islands were basically like the only source
Okay.
of nutmeg for the entire world. And the Bandanese people, they had been cultivating nutmeg for thousands of years.
Right.
And it was a really important part of their culture and their ecosystem.
I see.
And they really viewed it as a part of the natural world,
Yeah.
which is really different than how like the Europeans would view it.
Yeah. So they had like a sustainable relationship with it
Exactly.
for a really long time.
And they respected the nutmeg
Yeah.
and its place in the environment.
Yeah.
So when the Europeans came in, that's when things kind of went sideways a little bit.
Yeah, I can imagine.
But let's talk about how obsessed Europe was with nutmeg.
Okay.
So, I mean, obviously we all know that it tastes good.
It's nice and warm.
Yeah, it adds that warm, comforting flavor to food.
Yeah.
But back in the Middle Ages, nutmeg was worth more than gold.
Really?
Yeah.
That's amazing.
So what made it so valuable back then?
Well, you have to imagine a time, when spices weren't just something that, added flavor. They
Yeah.
were these treasures,
Yeah.
these exotic treasures from this far off land.
Right.
And nutmeg, with that really warm, aromatic flavor, it was like a luxury.
Yeah.
Only a few could afford it. And they used it in savory dishes and sweet treats. And they even thought it had medicinal properties.
Wow.
I mean, it was a sign that you had wealth
Yeah.
and sophistication. And, Europeans would pay a lot for it.
I can picture these medieval feasts, right?
Yeah.
With everybody showing off their silver nutmeg graters and being like, look at me, I can afford this freshly grated nutmeg on my food.
Right. It wasn't just a tool, it was art.
Right.
I mean, they were beautiful, crafted from precious metals,
Wow.
adorned with all these intricate designs. And if you owned one, it was a sign that you were somebody,
Yeah.
you could indulge.
Yeah.
It's really interesting, how the value of nutmeg wasn't just flavor.
Right.
It was a way to connect to this world beyond Europe's borders.
Yeah. But this obsession with nutmeg had like a dark side.
Oh,
And that's where the Dutch East India Company comes in.
right, the VOC.
Yeah, they saw how much money could be made off of nutmeg,
Yeah,
and they wanted to control it all.
I see.
So the VOC, they decided that instead of just trading for nutmeg like everyone else,
Mhm.
they wanted to just take over the whole operation.
Wow.
And they didn't really care about, trading fairly or the
Ah.
Bandanese people.
Yeah.
They wanted all the control, and they were willing to do whatever it took to get it.
Wow. So what did they do?
Well, they went to the Banda Islands, and what they did is really a horrible story of exploitation and violence.
I've heard a little bit about this, but I
Yes.
don't know the details.
So what happened was they used some pretty brutal tactics.
Okay.
They massacred people. They
Yeah.
forced people off of their land.
Wow.
And they pretty much tried to destroy the Bandanese culture.
That's awful.
Yeah, and, they destroyed trees on other islands that were growing nutmeg
Oh, wow.
to try to control the supply.
Just to control it.
Yeah, and they would even burn their own stock of nutmeg if there was too much so that they could manipulate the prices.
Wow. So they would rather destroy it
Yeah.
than have the price go down.
And they even made fake maps so that nobody could find the Banda Islands.
Wow.
It was all very calculated.
Yeah.
And, the human cost
Yeah.
was really high.
It's terrible. I mean,
Yeah.
it's just hard to believe that something like a spice could be the reason for so much violence
Right.
and exploitation.
It really makes you think about
Yeah.
the things that we use every day
Yeah.
and the history behind them.
And, this is just one example
Yeah.
of how colonialism, just took advantage of people
Right.
and resources.
Yeah. And it's important that we talk about these things so that we can acknowledge
Yeah.
what happened
Yeah.
and understand how it's still affecting us today.
Absolutely. And, Thankfully, the Dutch didn't have control over nutmeg forever.
That's right.
There was this Frenchman
Oh, yeah?
named Pierre Poivre.
He sounds like a really cool guy.
He does.
Like a real action hero.
Yeah.
He basically risked his life to smuggle nutmeg seedlings out of the Banda Islands.
Wow. So he was like a botanical spy.
Exactly.
That's amazing.
So why do you think he did that?
Well, I think he was a really interesting guy. He was a botanist and he was a visionary.
Okay.
And he really believed that knowledge shouldn't be kept secret, that it
Yeah.
should be shared.
Right.
And he thought that the Dutch monopoly on nutmeg was really unfair.
Yeah.
So he was determined to break it. And what he did was really bold.
Yeah.
It was an act of rebellion against this powerful company.
So he actually smuggled these seedlings out.
Yeah.
And it worked.
Yeah. And, you know, it's interesting because his actions really changed the course of nutmeg's history.
That's crazy to think about.
One person's actions
Mhm.
can have huge consequences.
And thanks to Pierre Poivre, nutmeg eventually ended up being cultivated in new places, and the Dutch lost their control.
Exactly. I mean, it spread to the Caribbean.
Yeah.
Grenada became a major producer,
Right.
and that really impacted the island's economy.
Yeah, it's so amazing how nutmeg went from these remote islands in Indonesia
Yeah.
to this luxury item in Europe, and then it spread to the Caribbean.
Right.
And, like, it's affected economies and cultures everywhere. It's gone.
And it really makes you think about how we as consumers, you know,
Yeah.
should think about this history.
Right. Is it just an ingredient,
Yeah.
or is there more to it?
Exactly. And I think that's something that we should all consider.
Yeah, definitely.
It's pretty amazing how you can see the whole story of globalization just by looking at nutmeg.
Yeah.
It went from this tiny little place to all over the world.
Right. And I think it really shows how everything is connected.
Exactly.
You know, even something as basic as a spice can change economies and cultures
Yeah.
and even politics.
Total.
But before we move on to nutmeg's impact on different cultures, I want to go back to those nutmeg graters for a second.
Oh, yeah.
You were talking about how they were like a status symbol back in medieval Europe.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to imagine that today, like, you know, people don't really care about spice graters that much anymore.
I know. It shows how much things have changed, right?
Right.
Back then, spices were like this super rare thing that
Yeah.
most people couldn't even get.
Yeah.
Imagine walking through a market
Mm-hmm.
and smelling that freshly grated nutmeg.
Oh, yeah.
It would have been incredible.
Yeah.
And it was a sign that you were rich.
Right.
If you could afford to have your own nutmeg grater.
Yeah. Especially if it was made of silver or gold.
Right, exactly.
Like, that's serious money.
It was like having a fancy car or a designer handbag today.
Yeah. Just a way to show off.
Totally. And it shows how objects can mean different things to different people.
Right.
They're not just about what they do, but also about what they represent.
Yeah. Like what people value in society.
Exactly.
But, you know, you can't forget about the dark side of nutmeg.
Right.
The Dutch East India Company did some terrible things in the Banda Islands.
Yeah, it's off.
They killed people,
Yeah.
forced them from their homes, and tried to wipe out their whole culture.
It's a really dark part of history.
It is. In the VOC, they basically created the playbook for how to exploit colonies.
Mm-hmm.
And sadly, it happened in other places too.
Yeah, over and over again.
So it's important to remember these things and see how they still affect the world today.
Yeah, for sure.
But even with all the bad stuff, we also see people fighting back.
Yeah.
Like Pierre Poivre, who smuggled those nutmeg seedlings.
He was amazing.
He really was.
He stood up for what he thought was right.
Right. And he believed that knowledge should be shared.
Mm-hmm.
He was a true visionary.
And what he did was so brave.
It really was. He changed the course of history.
Yeah, one person can make a difference.
Exactly.
And because of him, nutmeg spread to new places.
Right, like the Caribbean.
Exactly. Grenada became a big nutmeg producer.
Yeah, I've always thought of Grenada as the Nutmeg Island.
It is pretty much.
I never knew how it got there, though.
It's a cool story, actually.
Right.
Nutmeg came to Grenada, and it changed everything. New businesses popped up, farming changed, and even the food people ate was different.
That's crazy.
Yeah, and now Grenada is one of the biggest nutmeg producers in the world.
So nutmeg went from these tiny islands in Indonesia to Europe and then the Caribbean. It's amazing how it's touched so many different places.
It really is.
But the story doesn't end there.
What else is there?
Ugh, we have to talk about nutmeg in America.
Oh, yeah.
Ever heard of wooden nutmegs?
Of course, it's a classic American story.
It is.
All about Yankee ingenuity.
Right.
Maybe a little bit of trickery, too.
Yeah, so the story goes that these guys from Connecticut
Mm-hmm.
would sell fake nutmegs made of wood to people.
I know they carved them so carefully, too.
Right, they looked just like real nutmegs.
Nutmeg was expensive and hard to find back then.
Exactly. So people were willing to pay a lot for it.
Makes sense.
And those Connecticut peddlers,
Mm.
they saw a way to make a quick buck.
Yeah, classic.
But do you think it was a real thing?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
Some people say it was just a story. Yeah, maybe a way to make fun of those Yankee peddlers. You know? They were known for being clever.
Right?
And maybe not always honest.
So it might have been more about stereotypes than actual scams.
Could be, but it's still a fun story.
It is.
And it tells us a lot about how people thought back then.
Yeah, like what they were afraid of or who they didn't trust.
Right, and it shows how a simple spice can get mixed up with all these cultural ideas.
Yeah, it's more than just a spice at that point.
Exactly.
So nutmeg started in Indonesia, became a luxury in Europe, led to some awful things happening, and then became a symbol of American trickery.
It's quite a journey.
It really is.
Makes you wonder what will happen to nutmeg in the future.
I mean, will people still just think of it as, just another spice in their cabinet?
Right.
Or will they start to think about it, as something more?
Yeah.
Because it has this really long and kind of crazy history.
Yeah, I think, as people learn more about where their food comes from
Right.
and how what they buy affects the world,
Yeah.
they're going to be more interested in, the whole story. And nutmeg is a perfect example of that.
Yeah, it shows how something so small can be connected to so many things.
Right? It's like faraway places and traditions
Yeah.
and even like ethical questions.
Right. It makes you realize that the choices you make when you're shopping
Yeah.
actually do matter.
Totally.
Like where you buy your nutmeg from and how much you're willing to pay for it.
Right.
It all makes a difference.
And this isn't just about nutmeg. It's
Yeah.
about everything we buy.
Yeah.
Like, we should all be thinking about where stuff comes from
Mm-hmm.
and who made it.
Yeah. And what the impact was on the environment and stuff.
Exactly.
It's really about being curious
Yeah.
and appreciating all the stories behind the things we use every day.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah. So next time you see nutmeg,
Yeah.
whether you're cooking with it or you smell it in a candle, or even if you just hear somebody talking about it,
Yeah.
take a second to think about its journey.
Right. It's pretty amazing.
It really is. And it reminds us that humans are capable of some incredible things.
Yeah. Both good and bad.
True. But it also shows how powerful something as simple as a spice can be.
Totally.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive into nutmeg.
That was really interesting.
Yeah, I hope everybody enjoyed learning about it as much as we did.
Me too.
And remember, there's always something new to discover out there, so keep exploring and keep asking questions, and most importantly, keep trying new things.
That's what it's all about.